The Bible begins the story of humanity with Adam and Eve. The first human is shaped from the dust by the hand of God. Life is breathed into his nostrils, and he becomes a living being. His name is Adam. Seeing his loneliness, God causes him to fall into a deep sleep and creates a woman from one of his ribs, Eve. These two are not merely the first people. They are the root of all human lineage. God blesses them and gives them a command. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and have dominion over it. Behind this command lies not just a biological process, but a divine plan. Through this couple, humanity would spread across the face of the earth. Time passes. Adam and Eve have children. First Cain, then Abel. But pride and jealousy, embedded in human nature, soon manifest. Cain murders his brother. It is the first recorded act of violence in history. God curses Cain. The soil will no longer yield its strength to him. He becomes a wanderer, estranged from the presence of God. Cain departs toward the east, to the land of Nod. And here, the Bible provides a quiet detail. Cain finds a wife, fathers a son, and builds a city. He names the city after his son Enoch. But who is this woman? This is a question that has fueled centuries of debate. If Adam and Eve were the first humans, then where did Cain's wife come from? The answer lies between the lines. Genesis 5 verse 4 tells us, after Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. This verse reveals a broader family picture. Adam and Eve didn't only have 3 children. They had many sons and daughters. These children married each other. It was the only way humanity could grow. Today, this would be unthinkable. Incest is both morally and genetically unacceptable in modern societies. But in the beginning, things were different. Humanity was young. Genetic structures were intact. No mutations, no inherited flaws. Adam and Eve were direct creations of God. Their DNA was pure. Therefore, their children could marry each other without biological risks or divine prohibition. At that time, God had not yet delivered detailed laws concerning marriage. These would come centuries later through Moses, recorded in Leviticus. There, inter-family unions were strictly forbidden. But during Cain's era, no such laws existed. Humanity was still one family, and that family needed to grow. So, Cain's wife was most likely his sister. This may sound uncomfortable, but it aligns perfectly with the Bible's own timeline and logic. Humanity came from one man and one woman. Their children intermarried by necessity, not immorality. Cain settles in Nod with his wife and builds a life. He fathers Enoch. A city arises. Civilization begins. Among his descendants are artisans, musicians, and metalworkers. Humanity steps into its creative potential. But this lineage also carries the weight of Cain's sin. One of Cain's descendants, Lamech, becomes the first polygamist and the second recorded murderer. The line that started with blood continues to echo violence. And yet, God's mercy is evident. He does not destroy Cain. Instead, he marks him for protection. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over, says God. This divine statement reflects a complex justice, a balance of punishment and preservation. Cain, though guilty, is still under God's watch. Over time, Adam and Eve have many children, though not all are named. Calculations based on their lifespan suggest they could have had more than 50 children and thousands of descendants. These descendants form tribes, cultures, and civilizations. Yet they all trace back to one origin, Adam and Eve. For the modern mind, this story may sound mythical, but to the biblical worldview, it is history, sacred, foundational, and true. And it carries a profound message. All humans are brothers and sisters, different tongues, colors, and nations, yet one bloodline, created in the image of God. This truth undermines all notions of superiority. Racism, prejudice, and division fall apart before the fact that we are all kin. Cain, now exiled from the presence of God, settles in the land of Nod. Though cursed, he is not abandoned. He builds a city and names it after his son, Enoch. Through him, a line of descendants emerges, men who would leave their marks on early civilization. From Cain's lineage come figures like Lamech, remembered not just for being the first polygamist, but for taking the life of another man. His declaration, defiant and proud, echoes through Genesis 4. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Violence, once introduced through Cain, begins to spread. The line born from rebellion gives rise to innovation. Musicians, smiths, builders, but also deep moral corruption. Humanity, though advancing in skill, drifts from its creator. But while Cain's descendants shaped the early world, the story of Adam and Eve continues. After Abel's death and Cain's banishment, Adam and Eve are given another son, Seth, and it is through Seth that the righteous line emerges. Genesis 5 recounts the genealogy of Seth, and with it, a spiritual distinction. From this line comes men like Enoch, not to be confused with Cain's son, who walked with God, and Noah, who become the bearer of divine judgment and mercy. So humanity splits. Two lines, two directions, one of violence, the other of faith. But before we explore these lines further, a difficult truth remains to be addressed. The nature of early human relationships, particularly those that today would be called incest. The idea that Cain married his sister is often unsettling, but it was not unique to him. According to Genesis 5 verse 4, Adam and Eve had many sons and daughters. These children, by necessity, married one another. This was the only way to fulfill God's command. Be fruitful and multiply. At that time, no divine law had prohibited such unions. There was no Levitical code, no moral condemnation. Moreover, from a biological standpoint, there was little to fear. The human genome was still in its pristine state. There were no inherited mutations or genetic defects to endanger offspring. It is only much later, as humanity multiplies and sin takes root, that the physical and moral consequences of such unions become evident. Mutations begin to accumulate. The risk of genetic disorders increases when close relatives marry. And so, God introduces new laws. Through Moses, he gives the people of Israel a moral framework. Leviticus 18 outlines prohibited relationships in clear terms. No sexual relations with close family members, mother, sister, aunt, daughter-in-law. These are called abominations. God's purpose is twofold: to protect the physical health of future generations and to preserve the spiritual integrity of his people. These laws reflect not a change in divine nature, but progression in divine revelation. God does not change, but his guidance unfolds progressively according to humanity's readiness to understand and obey. In the beginning, humanity was like a child. It needed simple instructions and room to grow. As it matured, the moral code grew more specific. This is why the relationships we read about in Genesis are not always judged by the same standards as those in Leviticus and beyond. Context matters. The divine law was not yet given. The world was still in its infancy. Still, the Bible does not hide the consequences of unlawful or immoral unions. Even in early history, several disturbing episodes are recorded. Abraham, before the law, married his half-sister Sarah. God still blessed them, for the law had not yet been revealed. Isaac, son of Abraham, married his cousin Rebekah, a practice accepted then and even today in some cultures. Jacob, son of Isaac, married his cousins Rachel and Leah, two sisters. Again, this occurred before the law. But Amram, father of Moses, married his aunt Jochebed. This would later be forbidden by Levitical law. Yet from this union came Moses, the lawgiver himself. God, in his mercy, used imperfect people to accomplish his perfect will. Lot, Abraham's nephew, fathered children with his daughters. This was not condoned, but born of desperation and ignorance after the destruction of Sodom. The resulting offspring became Moab and Ammon, nations that later opposed Israel. Judah, son of Jacob, had relations with his daughter-in-law Tamar, believing her to be a prostitute. Though the act was deceptive, God permitted a lineage to continue through their son Perez, an ancestor of King David. Amnon, son of David, raped his half-sister Tamar. This violent act led to his death at the hands of Tamar's brother Absalom and sparked a civil war in Israel. Here, the Bible is clear. Such behavior was evil and condemned. These stories show the complexity of early human relationships. The Bible neither glorifies nor hides these events. Instead, it reveals the brokenness of humanity and the unwavering justice and mercy of God. In time, incest would become both a moral and spiritual violation. As the divine law was made known, such acts were condemned. But in the earliest days of mankind, they were a means of survival and obedience to God's original command. This shift illustrates a deeper truth. God's laws are always rooted in love, wisdom, and purpose. As humanity evolves, so too does its capacity to understand and uphold God's design. Thus, the story of Cain's wife is not just about genealogy. It is about the unfolding of divine revelation, the intersection of necessity and morality, and the way God leads his people from simplicity to spiritual maturity. By the time humanity had spread widely across the earth, the effects of sin had begun to ripple through every aspect of existence. What had begun as a pure and ordered creation was now tarnished. The lineages descending from Adam and Eve, including both Cain's and Seth's, face increasing challenges not only in moral clarity, but also in physical health. As sin continued to infect the human spirit, it also began to affect the human body. Over generations, the once perfect genetic code given to Adam and Eve began to deteriorate. Mutations, tiny, often invisible errors in DNA, started to accumulate. While these mutations may seem minor at first, their long-term effects are devastating. Hereditary diseases, mental and physical disabilities, and congenital deformities began to appear in children born from closely related parents. In the earliest generations, these defects were rare or non-existent. But over time, as the gene pool became increasingly affected by sin, the likelihood of passing on such traits grew. Close-kin unions, once harmless, became biologically risky. And so, God's law, revealed through Moses, began to show its brilliance not just spiritually, but scientifically. The prohibitions in Leviticus 18 were not arbitrary rules. They were divinely ordained protections. God, in his omniscience, understood what humanity would need even before it did. He knew that the purity of human genetics would not last forever. That sin would take its toll not just on hearts and minds, but on the very structure of the body. And so, he set boundaries to protect his people. These laws were meant to ensure that families remained whole, children were born healthy, and the nation of Israel would be set apart, physically and spiritually, from the corrupt practices of the pagan nations around them. In ancient Canaan, for example, incestuous relationships were part of ritualistic and cultural norms. Such behaviors were not only morally bankrupt, but also physically destructive. God's laws aimed to prevent Israel from adopting these devastating customs. But even among God's chosen people, the scars of earlier sins remained. The consequences of broken morality and disobedience often echoed across generations. Just as Cain's murder of Abel created a legacy of violence, so too did unlawful relationships leave a trail of disorder and pain. These aren't just ancient stories. They are warnings, reminders that actions ripple through time, that God's boundaries are drawn not to restrict us, but to guard us. And through all of this, a pattern emerges. God consistently redeems what is broken. Even in the worst failures, there is room for grace. Even when the law is broken, mercy is not far away. We see this in the stories of Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, women whose background were marked by scandal, yet whose descendants would lead to the Messiah. Their inclusion in the genealogy of Jesus Christ, detailed in Matthew 1, is no accident. It is a divine declaration. God writes straight with crooked lines. Sin may have consequences, but it does not have the final word. From Cain to Christ, the Bible traces a line of broken people, imperfect unions, flawed families, and a perfect God working through it all. This leads us to one of the most profound truths of the gospel. God does not demand perfection before he engages with us. Instead, he meets us in our brokenness and begins the work of restoration. The early generations, including Cain's descendants, lived in a world where God's law had not yet been fully given. Their lives were marked by survival, discovery, and often moral ambiguity. But over time, as revelation increased, so did responsibility. And with responsibility came the clarity of God's expectations. The idea of marrying within one's family evolved from being a necessity to becoming a sin. This change wasn't a contradiction. It was growth. Humanity matured, and God's law guided that maturity. Much like a parent guides a child, offering simple rules at first, then gradually teaching deeper principles. So too did God shepherd his people. The transition from freedom to structure, from simplicity to sacred order, was part of the divine plan. And within that plan, each generation played its role, some in obedience, others in rebellion. But God's faithfulness never wavered. Even when his people strayed, he called them back. Even when the line was corrupted, he preserved a remnant. Even when purity faded, his promise remained. And that promise was ultimately fulfilled not in perfect bloodlines, but in the perfect blood of Christ. As the generations progressed and humanity spread, so too did the complexity of its moral and spiritual struggles. From Cain to Noah, from Abraham to David, the world witnessed a tension between God's holiness and human frailty. Yet amid the disorder, one consistent truth stood firm. God was never absent. Cain's line, marked by rebellion and innovation, grew alongside Seth's line, which was defined by devotion and righteousness. These two branches represented more than family trees. They symbolized two divergent paths, one that drifted away from God, and another that pursued him despite the world's corruption. From Seth's line eventually came Noah, the man who would walk with God in a time when the earth was filled with violence and decay. The flood was not only a judgment, but a reset, a second beginning. Yet, even after the waters receded, sin remained embedded in the human condition. The story continued. Abraham was called out of Ur to be the father of many nations. Isaac and Jacob followed. Through Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel were born, setting the stage for a people chosen not because of their purity, but because of God's promise. It is here that the power of divine redemption begins to come into sharper focus. God had never required perfection to enact his plan. What he sought was obedience, humility, and faith. The bloodlines were often flawed. The individuals were sinners. But God used their lives, their choices, even their failures, to weave the tapestry of salvation. Cain's act of murder, while devastating, became the first recorded instance of God's justice and mercy intention. He punished Cain, yes, but he also protected him. He cast him out, yet marked him with a sign to shield him from vengeance. This act of grace foreshadowed the redemptive heart of God. As human history moved forward, the need for clearer moral boundaries became urgent. The laws given to Moses were a pivotal moment. They weren't merely rules. They were revelations of divine character. Through them, humanity learned what holiness looked like. Yet the law could not save. It could only reveal. And that is why the story of Cain and his wife ultimately points to a greater need, a redeemer, one who could not only define righteousness, but embody it. The genealogies, the broken marriages, the moral stumbles, all of them lead us to Jesus Christ. He did not come from a flawless lineage. He came from a line touched by scandal, marked by outsiders, filled with complicated stories. Rahab was a prostitute. Ruth was a Moabite. Bathsheba was the wife of another man. Tamar dressed as a prostitute to preserve a bloodline. And yet, all of these women are named in the genealogy of Christ. Why? Because God redeems what the world rejects. He restores what's in ruins. He transforms what seems lost. Cain's wife, though unnamed, represents the first union after the fall, a symbol of continuity despite tragedy. Her anonymity reminds us that God works through both the known and unknown. Her child, Enoch, and the city that bore his name, stand as testaments to civilization born out of exile. Even in judgment, God allows growth. Even in consequence, he permits legacy. Humanity's story is not a clean one. It is messy, unpredictable, and often painful. But it is also hopeful, because at every turn, God's grace waits. The issue of Cain's wife is not a contradiction. It's an invitation. An invitation to study, to question, and ultimately to trust. To see how the earliest moments of Scripture point toward a grand design. A design in which God creates, permits freedom, allows rebellion, but never abandons. A design where justice and mercy coexist. A story where even flawed beginnings can lead to redemptive endings. Today, as we look back on these ancient narratives, we are not just reading history. We are tracing the roots of our faith. We are witnessing the slow, deliberate unveiling of a God who never gives up on his creation. Cain's legacy is sobering, but it is not hopeless, because woven through his story and every story that followed is a scarlet thread of grace. And that thread leads us to the cross.